Oh, I'd much rather have one of the honest ones than one of the good ones.
Yeah, it's morally like that's a morally superior position to take, like than being a lying like person.
Yeah, I quote like at the very beginning of the book. I quote a few of them. Like that's ethnic cleansing was necessary. Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, says, "Okay, well, at least you're telling me rather than saying that there were no Palestinians or there was no ethnic cleansing." And yeah, but you see, this is the big thing. Like all these things that you're talking about, Sina, now, these represent the shift that's happening now, right? Right now, like in the past 5, 6, 7 years, it's very super recent, and it's with the present day government there, it's accelerating all the more. But the affiliations between the Zionist and Trump, for example, or Bolsonaro, who's now out, but famously his wife when she went to vote, Bolsonaro was wearing an Israeli T-shirt, and the affiliations were obvious. Modi in India, or other right-wing governments in Europe, and so on, right? So there's this very, very clear sense of an affiliation between the anti-immigrant, anti-rights, anti-minority viewpoints of these kinds of parties across the world with this Zionist project, which is this look, there's the perfection of the ethno state. That's what we, the right, I'm not one of them, but kind of channeling their way of thinking. That's what the right wants is ethno states where every ethnicity gets its own state, and people who are not members of the ethnicity need not apply. They can get lost, right? We're seeing that in Britain. We're seeing it in all France, of course, all across Europe, and of course, resurgent. It's not the only tendency, mind you. There's still very strong counter tendencies, as we just saw in Brazil, among other places. And there's so it's not this is not like a done deal, but the Israelis, I think they sense this shift. Personally, I think it's a miscalculation on their part, which I'm happy to see them make, because I think they've blown their cover now. Like they're when you have 60, 70 years of support based on your affiliations with, or you claim to be affiliated with, progressive left wing culture, even a socialist culture, which they pretend to, used to pretend to anyway, in various kinds of ways. They've abandoned all the things that the mechanisms of denial that kept them going for 60 or 70 years. They're dispensing with all that, more or less overnight, in political and historical terms, and they're seizing onto this right wing tendency. And there's no sense that this right wing tendency is necessarily. I mean, they seem to think this is the way of the future. I don't think I would. I hope it's not the way of the future. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know. But
It's a bigger it's what I mean, there is that thing of the contradictions of their own internal state, and how it's in a sense that, like, I was thinking about this last night, like their own diversity is a problem, because in some senses you have like all these Europeans who have nothing in common other than Zionism, right? Like their Jewishness is all over the map, right? Like how many people, like our whole earth has a secularism like stripe to it, and it's growing and growing in all kinds of places, right? So like you have this secularist group of people who are just there for like free real estate and like support, and it's a very generous, you could say even social democratic country, right? That encourages, and even you could say bribes people to come and live there, right? Like during this Ukraine stuff, there's been tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews that have made their way and emigrated, right? Like aliyah is the term, which is like, could start to becoming colonizers. Like that's one of the sort of, but at the same time, I think like the contradictions of their rule, of their and the contradictions are not just of their own project that we've been outlining, and you summarize so succinctly, but like also like that itself doesn't give you a solid foundation for your state, because at the end of the day, 90 or 95% of their population is in two cities, right? Like it's like two. It's not like Zionism is not that big. That it's like its country, sure, Israel has like a relatively large, like, geographical footprint, and it's also an important part of the world geographically. But in terms of like its natural resources, in terms of like what most of that land consists of, in terms of like all kinds of problems of like it's the fact that it is so hostile to its neighbors, therefore it has to rely on a few ports, by the way, that are very close to this group called Hezbollah, that have 100,000 like missiles that will then, like, what will they do for food? Like, what will you do for food if you're an Israeli if you have no ports, right? So like this is a sort of like structural problem that their own like settler colonial project failed to provide, which is roots ultimately. Like the roots are very shallow of Zionism. They have only planted, so to speak, for 100 years, and that process it takes a long time to make yourself into a people. You can have as many like you can have as much like you can scream about it and sort of like create as much culture as you want around it and like lobby for it and fantasize about it and create programs called birthright, which I still can't believe was a thing. Like the idea of a birthright, it was a real thing, and
It is,
it's like
it still is.
it
It
still is.
exists.
Oh, it's true, it still is. But
Yeah.
like it's the idea of a birthright, like that's a dirty word in like our modern era. Like, ew, that's gross. What are you, like a king of like an aristocrat? It sounds anachronistic, and it is anachronistic to fantasize about some magical stew in your genetics. Now, a Zionist would respond and say, "Oh, this is just our nationalism." However, that nationalism was located around a fundamental act of dislocation.
But the point is the way in which the Zionist project gets represented and represents itself. That's what we should come back to, right? The ways in which it successfully sold itself to Western progressive and liberals and as I said, leftists and even socialists, all for 50 or 60 or 70 years. It's now abandoning those same principles that enabled it to succeed, which is why its constituencies here are so profoundly shocked at what's going on now with this. I thought there was a democracy. I thought it had, where this is the claim, right? It's people are shocked that it turns out not to be as democratic. Because it seems to be shocking to from this point of view that the state is now dismantling its own judicial system, which of course is a judicial system that was never extended to half the population from the beginning to now. Half the people who live there have not been included in these so-called democratic and judicial forms of access and so on. And so it shouldn't be shocking at all, but it is because this narrative is falling apart. But we should go back and reconstitute what the narrative is, and which is what the book is. That's what I'm saying. The book is like an archaeology of a narrative that is right now in crisis, but it wasn't always in crisis. It sustained it remarkably, so that I have friends on the left, European friends on the left, who when they were younger in their 20s and 30s and whatever, went to a kibbutz. That's what people in the European left did
It
at one
wasn't a
point.
colony; it was a kibbutz,
Yeah,
Saree.
that's what I'm
It was
saying.
a colony.
But they could inhabit it, and along the like. What a powerful narrative that is.
Yeah.
That they were able to subsume critical people who would otherwise have, smart politics and be smart on their feet, so forth. It was a combination of mystification and denial and misinformation and disinformation and so forth. But these very, very powerful mechanisms that allowed progressive people, to attach themselves to this vision of making the desert bloom and creating a culture that's open to all and treats gay people equally and so on and so forth, right? And that's all right now in crisis.
Yeah, this is the page 9. My argument. This is what you do. This is what you say. My argument is that these two aspects of Zionism are actively bound up. This is where you're earlier. I should read the earlier part. Said, talking about Edward Said, pushes this bifurcation in Zionism perhaps a bit too far. However, although he refers to it as a dialectic, he's not really developing a dialectical argument. The two sides of his coin function separately from each other, rather than depending on each other. There is Zionism for Jews over here and Zionism for Palestinians over there. My argument is that these two aspects of Zionism are actively bound up with and need each other, at least through the first part of its existence and until the 2000s. The Zionist project in Palestine fundamentally depended on support and sustenance of the most or otherwise progressive liberal sectors of US and European society, including Jewish communities that have historically been associated with progressive and liberal causes, and that have, for example, deep affinities with civil rights struggle in the United States. So like this is, and then I'll fast forward here. There's simply, and this is you sort of sum it up. There's simply no way that Zionism could have attracted and maintained the support of these left-leaning sectors of society without the forms of denial that this book aims to explore. And in turn, there's no way that the Zionist project in Palestine could have sustained the level of damage is inflicted on Palestinians. Everything from ethnic cleansing to home demolition, to torture, land expropriation, and outright bombardment without European and American support in general, and the support of progressive and liberals in particular.